In 2014, superhero cinema had developed a very particular idea of what it was supposed to look like. The genre had learned from The Dark Knight that comic book stories could be grim, grounded, morally complicated, and almost allergic to anything that felt too ridiculous. Marvel itself was still largely operating on Earth, building its universe through familiar superheroes, military organizations, billionaires, spies, and gods. The visual language was increasingly polished, but the emotional vocabulary often remained serious. And then Marvel announced a movie about a talking raccoon, a walking tree, a green alien assassin, a muscle-bound warrior who takes everything literally, and a human thief who dances through an alien ruin while an old pop song blasts through his headphones. On paper, it sounded less like the next evolution of the superhero movie and more like a studio losing its mind. The strangest part is that Marvel did not merely survive this gamble. It turned the gamble into one of its most important creative victories. Nobody looking at the obscure Guardians of the Galaxy comics could reasonably assume that this team would become a global phenomenon, let alone earn hundreds of millions of dollars and eventually stand beside Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor as one of Marvel's defining groups. The movie's greatest trick was not convincing audiences that a raccoon could be a hero. It was convincing them that they had been waiting for a raccoon to be a hero all along. But before the laughter, before the spaceship battles, and before Groot became one of the most recognizable characters in modern pop culture, Guardians of the Galaxy begins somewhere unexpectedly intimate. It begins in a hospital room in 1988, with a frightened child being asked to confront the death of his mother. Peter Quill does not want to take her hand. He cannot process what is happening. He runs. That decision quietly becomes the emotional blueprint for everything that follows. The space pirate, the swagger, the jokes, the stolen artifacts, the ridiculous nickname, the constant need to perform confidence. All of it grows from a boy who never learned how to stand still in front of grief. That is what makes the movie's tonal contradiction so fascinating. The film looks like an explosion of color and comedy, but underneath the jokes is a story about children who never really stopped hurting. Marvel's biggest risk was therefore also its most revealing experiment. The studio did not save superhero cinema by making another serious hero. It expanded the emotional possibilities of the genre by admitting that damaged people could be funny, ridiculous, selfish, loud, and still worthy of being loved. And that is where the real story of Guardians of the Galaxy begins. To understand why this movie still works, we have to look beyond the obvious nostalgia. We will begin with the unusual circumstances that brought this forgotten corner of Marvel into the center of the cinematic universe, tracing the project from Nicole Perlman's early screenplay work to James Gunn's arrival, and the casting gamble that transformed Chris Pratt from a television comic into a blockbuster leading man. From there, we will move through the story itself, examining how the film introduces 5 damaged strangers and gradually turns their individual survival instincts into something resembling family. We will look closely at Peter Quill, Gamora, Rocket, Groot, and Drax because the Guardians are not simply a collection of quirky personalities. Each one represents a different response to loss. One hides behind humor. One hides behind violence. One hides behind arrogance. One hides behind literal thinking. And one barely speaks at all, yet somehow becomes the emotional center of the group. We will then explore the film's visual language, its use of color, its recurring imagery of hands, touch, light, and physical objects, and especially the cassette player that connects Peter's adult life to the mother he lost as a child. We will examine James Gunn's directing style, and the technical achievement of making characters like Rocket and Groot feel emotionally present beside human performers. We will also spend time with Tyler Bates' score and the licensed songs, because the awesome mix is doing far more narrative work than simply making the movie sound cool. Those songs function almost like another character, the lingering emotional voice of Meredith Quill. From there, the discussion expands into the film's cultural impact, its critical reception, its financial success, its influence on later blockbusters, and the criticisms that keep the movie from being completely flawless. And finally, we will ask the larger question: why does this particular superhero movie still matter when the genre itself has become increasingly familiar? That question feels especially important now, in an era when audiences have become more skeptical of endless cinematic universes and increasingly sensitive to the formula behind them. Guardians of the Galaxy arrived when superhero fatigue was not yet the dominant conversation, but it accidentally provided one of the answers to the problem. It demonstrated that spectacle alone is not enough. What audiences remember is personality. They remember relationships. They remember a song that suddenly makes a joke heartbreaking. And most importantly, they remember characters who feel as though they existed before the movie began, and will continue existing after the credits disappear. There is a particular emotional warmth attached to an old cassette tape that modern streaming technology can almost never reproduce. You had to physically hold it. You had to turn it over. You had to rewind it with patience. You knew that somebody had chosen those songs deliberately, and when that person mattered to you, the music became inseparable from them. That is why Peter Quill's Walkman feels so much more important than an ordinary piece of retro technology. For Peter, music is memory with a physical shape. Every song carries a piece of a life that disappeared before he was ready to lose it. For audiences who grew up with cassettes, CDs, old radios, mixtapes, or even the fading culture of making playlists for specific people, that feeling is instantly recognizable. And for younger viewers, the movie creates a fantasy version of that same experience. The idea that a collection of songs can become a private language between two people. That emotional idea is also the secret behind the Guardians themselves. They are outsiders. None of them fits comfortably into the heroic mold. Peter is a thief who desperately wants to be admired. Gamora is an assassin trying to escape the person she was forced to become. Drax has allowed grief to turn him into a weapon. Rocket expects betrayal because he has experienced cruelty. Groot communicates through a phrase that almost nobody understands. They are, in different ways, losers. And that word matters because the film never treats being a loser as the opposite of being heroic. Instead, it suggests that failure, rejection, loneliness, and damaged histories can create people who understand one another in ways polished heroes sometimes cannot. That is why the Guardians feel so immediately human despite living among aliens, spaceships, cosmic weapons, and ancient civilizations. They are not united because they are perfect. They are united because they recognize the loneliness in each other. And if you revisit the movie after understanding that, the film starts revealing details that are easy to miss the first time. A joke becomes a defense mechanism. A song becomes a memory. A fight becomes an attempt to avoid vulnerability. A seemingly disposable prop becomes a connection to Peter's mother. Even the moments that look like pure comedy often contain small pieces of emotional information. The first viewing gives you the adventure. The second viewing gives you the architecture underneath it. And that is exactly why this movie deserves to be revisited. Because beneath the colorful spectacle is a carefully constructed story about people who have spent their entire lives pretending they do not need anyone. The strangest thing about Guardians of the Galaxy is that its eventual cultural importance was almost impossible to predict from the property's history. The version of the Guardians that audiences encountered in 2014 was heavily shaped by the 2008 comic book reboot written by Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, which assembled a very different collection of characters around a cosmic Marvel setting that could support stories far beyond the familiar streets of New York. The team had existed in earlier forms, but the modern incarnation gave Marvel something particularly valuable: a group of characters whose very obscurity allowed filmmakers to redefine them for a new audience. Unlike Iron Man or Captain America, the Guardians did not arrive with decades of mainstream cultural expectations weighing on them. There was room to experiment. There was room to be strange. And that creative freedom became essential when screenwriter Nicole Perlman entered the picture. Perlman worked within Marvel's screenwriting program and became one of the people who recognized that this obscure cosmic property could actually become a feature film. Her contribution was important precisely because it was not initially glamorous. She helped develop the screenplay before the project had the cultural certainty that would later surround it. At the time, Marvel was still proving that its interconnected cinematic universe could work. Turning a talking tree and a genetically modified raccoon into the centerpiece of a $170 million-plus production represented a very different kind of gamble. The project needed a director who could handle enormous spectacle without sanding away the weirdness that made the characters interesting. James Gunn was an unusual choice. His background included independent filmmaking, dark comedy, horror, irreverent genre work, and the chaotic energy associated with trauma. He was not the obvious architect for a polished Disney-backed cosmic adventure. And that was precisely why he became such a powerful choice. Gunn understood something that a more conventional blockbuster director might have missed. The movie could not succeed by apologizing for its absurdity. If the audience was going to accept Rocket, Groot, and Peter Quill, the film had to treat them as completely real within its own world. The comedy could be outrageous, but the emotional consequences had to remain sincere. That balance became Gunn's defining challenge. Then came Peter Quill. Chris Pratt was already familiar to television audiences through Parks and Recreation, where he had built a reputation as a lovable, physically comic, seemingly irresponsible performer. The idea of placing him at the center of a massive science fiction adventure was initially difficult to imagine. He did not resemble the traditional muscular action star audiences associated with superhero movies. But Gunn saw another quality beneath the comedy: charisma. Pratt could make Peter seem ridiculous without making him pathetic. He could be selfish without becoming completely unlikable. He could turn a joke into a shield and then, almost instantly, let the audience see the hurt beneath it. The physical transformation helped, but the performance mattered more. Peter had to be believable as a man who could survive among killers while still carrying the emotional immaturity of a child who had never processed his mother's death. The casting of the rest of the team followed the same philosophy. Zoe Saldaña brought physical credibility and emotional restraint to Gamora. Dave Bautista, whose professional wrestling career made him an unexpected dramatic choice, found comedy in Drax's inability to understand metaphor. Bradley Cooper's voice gave Rocket an aggressive, wounded intelligence, while Sean Gunn's physical reference work helped establish Groot's movement. Vin Diesel reduced his dialogue to one recurring phrase and somehow made it emotionally expressive through rhythm, timing, and vocal variation. None of these decisions were safe in isolation. Together, they became the film's greatest advantage. Marvel was essentially betting that audiences would care about people they had never heard of, played by performers they did not necessarily associate with these roles, in a cosmic setting that had barely been explored in the MCU. The studio's answer was not to make the property more conventional. It was to make the characters more emotionally specific. That distinction would ultimately determine everything. Before audiences saw the finished movie, the skepticism was almost unavoidable. Marvel had already established a successful formula, and Guardians of the Galaxy appeared determined to disrupt it. The central question was simple. Why should anyone care? Iron Man had a recognizable face. Captain America represented one of the most famous superheroes in American culture. Thor came from mythology. Even lesser-known heroes had familiar visual identities. Guardians offered a thief, an assassin, a tree, a raccoon, and a giant warrior. To many observers, it looked like Marvel had finally reached the point where the studio was scraping the bottom of its comic book universe. The phrase "a tree and a raccoon" became an easy shorthand for the project's perceived absurdity. The timing made the gamble even more interesting. By 2014, superhero movies were no longer experimental. They were major commercial events, and audiences had developed expectations about how they should behave. Marvel's films were generally funny, but their humor existed within recognizable superhero structures. Guardians was asking audiences to travel into a corner of the universe where almost none of those structures applied. The marketing therefore had an enormous problem. How do you sell unfamiliar characters without explaining so much that the mystery disappears? Marvel's answer was remarkably simple. Make the weirdness the selling point. The teaser trailer opened with blue Swedes hooked on a feeling, and suddenly the movie did not look like an obscure comic book adaptation struggling to justify itself. It looked like something audiences had never seen before. The song immediately communicated the tone more effectively than pages of exposition could have done. There was swagger, comedy, adventure, and a strange sense of nostalgia. Then came the characters. Rocket's attitude, Groot's simplicity, Drax's seriousness, Gamera's danger, and Peter Quill dancing through the middle of it all as if the fate of the galaxy could wait until the song finished. The trailer did not hide the movie's oddness. It weaponized it. That strategy transformed skepticism into curiosity. The central marketing question shifted from "Why would I watch this?" to "What exactly is this?" And curiosity is often more powerful than familiarity. The film also benefited from its ability to combine two seemingly incompatible pleasures. On one side was enormous cosmic world building. Alien civilizations, ancient artifacts, interstellar empires, spaceships, warships, and an infinity stone capable of destroying worlds. On the other was a comedy about emotionally damaged idiots trying not to kill each other. The contrast made the film accessible. You did not need to understand every piece of Marvel's cosmic mythology to understand Peter being embarrassed by his own nickname. You did not need to know the history of the Kree to laugh when Drax took a metaphor literally. You could enter through the jokes and gradually discover that the universe around them was much larger than expected. That was the brilliance of the marketing and the film itself. It did not demand that audiences become experts before they could enjoy the story. It invited them in through personality. And once viewers cared about the characters, the cosmic mythology became more interesting, because it suddenly had emotional stakes. The result was one of the most successful reversals of pre-release expectations in modern blockbuster cinema. A project many people had assumed could become Marvel's first major misfire instead became evidence that the studio could take almost any corner of its universe and make audiences care, provided it found the right voice. The movie begins not in space but in a hospital room on Earth in 1988, and that decision tells us almost everything about what kind of story we are about to watch. Young Peter Quill is sitting beside his dying mother Meredith, surrounded by the quiet terror of adults who already understand what is happening. Peter does not. Or perhaps more accurately, he understands enough to be terrified but not enough to accept it. His mother asks him to take her hand. He refuses. He is frightened, overwhelmed, and desperate to escape the reality in front of him. After her death, Peter runs outside, carrying the emotional shock of the moment with him. Then the impossible happens. A spacecraft arrives, and the boy is abducted by the Ravagers. Within minutes, Peter's entire world disappears. Earth, his mother, his childhood, and everything familiar are replaced by the cold expanse of space. The movie does not immediately explain how that trauma will shape him. Instead, it lets the audience watch the consequences decades later. 26 years pass and Peter Quill is now known throughout the galaxy as Star-Lord, a self-proclaimed legendary outlaw whose confidence is considerably greater than his reputation. He arrives on the planet Morag searching for a mysterious orb. The title sequence plays over "Come and Get Your Love," and the contrast is almost comically perfect. We have just witnessed a child's devastating loss, and now we are watching the adult version of that child dance through ancient alien ruins while wearing headphones. He kicks creatures out of his way, explores the abandoned landscape, and treats the dangerous environment like his own personal playground. It is funny, stylish, and deliberately immature. But there is something deeper happening in that transition. Peter has not simply grown up. He has built an identity around refusing to behave like the frightened child we met in the hospital. The swagger is armor. The music is memory. The nickname is performance. When Peter finally reaches the chamber containing the orb, he discovers that stealing it is not going to be as easy as he imagined. Karath the Pursuer and his forces arrive, demanding the artifact. Peter escapes through a combination of improvisation, arrogance, and luck, barely surviving the confrontation. What he does not know is that the orb is far more important than its appearance suggests. It contains a power capable of catastrophic destruction, and several powerful forces are already searching for it. Peter only sees an opportunity to make money. The audience, however, can already sense the collision coming. The thief thinks he has found another score. Instead, he has stumbled into the center of a conflict involving empires, assassins, ancient weapons, and forces far beyond his understanding. Yet the film never abandons its comedy. Peter remains Peter. He dances. He jokes. He improvises. He calls himself Star-Lord even when people clearly do not know who that is. And beneath all of it is the boy from 1988, still running away from the moment when his mother asked him to hold her hand. The adventure begins because Peter wants the orb. The story matters because eventually he will have to learn what it means to hold on instead of running away. Peter's plan is simple. Sell the orb and disappear with the money. The problem is that almost everyone else who knows about the orb wants it too. When Peter arrives on Xander, the conflict immediately becomes a collision of competing agendas. He attempts to sell the artifact to a broker, only to discover that Gamora has been sent to retrieve it. Gamora is not simply another thief. She is an elite assassin working for Ronan the Accuser and, by extension, for Thanos. Her mission is straightforward: take the orb and deliver it. Peter refuses to cooperate, and before either side can gain control, two bounty hunters enter the equation. Rocket, a genetically modified raccoon with an attitude far larger than his body, and Groot, his towering tree companion, have been tracking Peter for the bounty placed on him. What follows is one of the film's clearest statements of identity. Instead of giving us a traditional heroic introduction, the movie stages a chaotic four-way confrontation where everyone is simultaneously trying to capture everyone else. Peter wants to escape. Gamora wants the orb. Rocket wants the bounty. Groot wants whatever Groot wants. Their motives collide, and the resulting fight is less about choreography than personality. Peter uses charm and improvisation. Gamora relies on precise combat skill. Rocket approaches the conflict like a tactical engineer who happens to be extremely angry. Groot uses his enormous physical power with almost childlike simplicity. The sequence is funny because the characters are incompatible, but it is also structurally important because it introduces the central idea of the movie. These people are going to become a team long before they understand how to function as one. Their conflict attracts the attention of the Nova Corps, who have been monitoring the increasingly disruptive situation on Xandar. The authorities arrive and arrest all four. Suddenly, the thief, assassin, bounty hunters, and would-be heroes are thrown together inside the KYLN, a high-security prison. This is the moment when the movie begins tightening its emotional circle. The characters cannot simply walk away from each other anymore. Their lives have become physically connected by circumstance. Peter is annoyed. Gamora is furious. Rocket is calculating. Groot is calm. And then they meet Drax the Destroyer. Drax is unlike the others because he has almost completely abandoned the idea of ordinary life. His wife and daughter were murdered by Ronan, and he has transformed his grief into a single purpose: revenge. To Drax, Gamora is connected to Ronan and therefore becomes a target. The Guardians have not yet become a family. They are 5 dangerous strangers occupying the same space, each carrying a different wound and believing that survival requires isolation. The prison gives them something they have never had before: no easy escape from one another. And the more time they spend together, the clearer it becomes that the people who appear least trustworthy may eventually become the only people they can trust. The KYLN prison forces the group to confront the problem they have been avoiding. None of them can accomplish what they want alone. Gamora is almost killed by inmates who want to use her as leverage, and Peter intervenes, partly because he needs her alive and partly because the instinct to protect another person is beginning to appear beneath his selfish exterior. Drax initially sees Gamora as an enemy because of her connection to Ronan, but Peter's intervention creates the first crack in that assumption. Meanwhile, Rocket is already thinking 3 steps ahead. He knows the prison's security systems, understands the guards' routines, and has developed a plan to escape. The plan is complicated, ridiculous, and entirely dependent on equipment that seems impossible to obtain. That is where one of the film's most memorable comedy sequences emerges. Rocket needs a guard's prosthetic leg, and his obsession with the object becomes an absurd running joke that somehow turns into a key part of the escape. The humor works because Rocket's intelligence is never in doubt. He is ridiculous, but he is also the most technically capable person in the room. The others reluctantly follow his instructions, and the escape quickly becomes chaos. Drax fights. Gamora moves with precision. Peter improvises. Groot uses his abilities to create pathways and manipulate the environment. Rocket turns every available object into part of the plan. They are not coordinated because they trust each other. They are coordinated because the alternative is remaining in prison. That distinction matters. The Guardians' first victory is not friendship. It is cooperation. They begin discovering that their individual strengths become more useful when combined. Once they escape, they head toward nowhere, a mining colony built inside the severed head of an ancient celestial. The location immediately expands the film's visual and conceptual scale. Until this point, the characters have mostly been fighting over an object they barely understand. Now they are entering a world where ancient cosmic history is literally embedded into the environment. Their goal remains simple: sell the orb. Peter and the others still see the artifact primarily as money or leverage. They have not yet understood what they are carrying. Their journey to nowhere also gives the group a temporary sense of freedom. They are outside prison, moving through space together, and beginning to discover each other's personalities. Drax remains consumed by Ronan. Gamora begins revealing that her relationship with Thanos is not one of loyalty but survival. Rocket's cynicism becomes more visible. Groot quietly provides emotional stability without asking for recognition. Peter continues performing confidence, but his connection to Gamora begins to challenge the idea that he can simply disappear whenever things become difficult. The team is still unstable, but something has changed. They have started to become a unit. And that makes the next revelation more devastating, because the orb is not simply valuable. It is dangerous enough to make every personal conflict suddenly insignificant. Nowhere introduces the Guardians to Taneleer Tyvan, better known as the Collector, a mysterious figure obsessed with acquiring rare objects and beings from across the universe. When the orb is finally opened, the truth becomes horrifying. Inside is the Power Stone, one of the Infinity Stones, an ancient object capable of unleashing unimaginable destructive force. The Collector explains its history, connecting the artifact to civilizations that once attempted to wield powers they could not control. The Guardians have been treating the orb like a valuable package. Suddenly they realize they have been carrying something that can destroy worlds. The danger becomes immediate when Karina, one of the Collector's servants, attempts to use the stone herself. The resulting explosion demonstrates that the Power Stone is not a weapon that can simply be picked up and controlled. It consumes anyone who lacks the power to contain it. The film has shifted from a chaotic adventure into a cosmic survival story. Yet the characters remain their own worst enemies. Drax's grief has hardened into impatience, and his desire for revenge overwhelms his judgment. He contacts Ronan, believing that confronting the man responsible for his family's death will finally give him closure. Instead, he gives Ronan exactly what he needs: a direct path to the Guardians and the orb. Ronan arrives at nowhere with overwhelming force, and the fragile alliance immediately collapses under pressure. Gamora attempts to protect the orb and escape, but she is left drifting in the emptiness of space. Peter sees her and makes a choice that reveals how much he has changed. He gives her his helmet and uses his own equipment to reach her. He does not know whether he can survive. He simply refuses to let her die. The moment is important because Peter's entire identity has been built around self-preservation. His first instinct has always been to run, joke, steal, or disappear. Here, he moves toward danger because someone else needs him. Yondu's Ravagers eventually arrive and rescue Peter, but the damage is done. The group has been defeated. The orb is in enemy hands. Gamora is nearly dead. Drax's decision has endangered everyone. And Peter is once again separated from the people who had begun to become his family. This is the lowest point of the story because the Guardians have discovered that becoming a family creates something more frightening than loneliness. Something to lose. The film's emotional stakes are no longer theoretical. They have become personal. The question is no longer whether these people can survive together. It is whether they are willing to risk themselves for one another. The Guardians' final victory begins with a choice that would have been impossible for them at the beginning of the film. Peter returns to the group and convinces them that they cannot simply walk away from Xander. The odds are terrible. Ronan possesses overwhelming power, his forces are approaching, and the Guardians have every reason to protect themselves rather than sacrifice anything for strangers. Yet Peter appeals to something they have gradually developed without realizing it. They are not the people they were when they entered the KYLN. They have become something resembling a family. The famous standing up in a circle moment captures that transformation with almost ridiculous simplicity. None of them is suddenly noble. They are still criminals, killers, outsiders, and damaged people. But for the first time they choose to stand together. Even Yondu becomes part of the unlikely alliance. The Battle of Xander begins as the Nova Corps confronts Ronan's Dark Aster. Inside the chaos, the Guardians infiltrate the ship, each member contributing a different skill. Rocket's technology, Gamera's combat ability, Drax's strength, Groot's powers, and Peter's improvisational confidence finally function as a single system. They reach Ronan, but defeating him proves nearly impossible. Then Groot makes the choice that changes the emotional meaning of the entire story. He creates a protective structure around the others, using his own body to shield them from destruction. When the danger passes, Groot appears to have sacrificed himself. Rocket's grief is immediate. The creature he once treated as a business partner was actually his closest friend. The line "We are Groot" transforms Groot's recurring phrase into a declaration of collective identity. Groot is no longer speaking only for himself. He is speaking for the group. The Guardians then face Ronan in the most absurd possible way. Instead of overpowering him through conventional heroics, Peter distracts him with a dance-off. The scene is hilarious because it is exactly what the movie has taught us to expect from Peter. But it also works because Ronan's rigid seriousness makes him completely incapable of understanding the logic of the Guardians. Their greatest strength is unpredictability. While Peter keeps Ronan distracted, the others attack. When the Power Stone is finally exposed, Peter reaches for it and begins to lose control. The others grab him, then one another, sharing the unbearable energy rather than allowing Peter to carry it alone. This is the emotional culmination of the movie's central idea. The power that would destroy an individual becomes survivable when shared. The Guardians are literally holding one another together. Ronan is defeated. Xander survives. Groot's sacrifice leaves behind a small piece of new life, suggesting that loss does not necessarily mean complete disappearance. Peter's heritage and the truth about his mother remain unresolved, but he is no longer the same person who refused to hold her hand. The surviving Guardians are offered a new identity and a new future. They are still criminals. They are still chaotic. But now they have chosen one another. The story that began with a child running away from death ends with a group of wounded adults choosing to stand together in the face of it. Peter Quill is one of the most deceptively complicated protagonists Marvel had created up to that point because almost everything entertaining about him is also a symptom of something unresolved. On the surface, Peter wants money, freedom, recognition, and a reputation as the legendary Star-Lord. He steals because stealing gives him control. He jokes because jokes let him control a conversation. He flirts because charm gives him distance from genuine vulnerability. Even his name is a performance. Nobody around him seems particularly interested in calling him Star-Lord. But Peter insists on the title because it allows him to become someone larger than the frightened child he used to be. His external identity is built around confidence. His internal identity is frozen in 1988. That is the central contradiction of his character. Peter grows physically, but emotionally he never truly leaves the hospital room. His mother's death becomes the event around which his entire personality organizes itself. Instead of processing grief, he escapes it. Instead of accepting that his mother died, he builds a life in which Earth itself becomes almost irrelevant. He surrounds himself with alien culture, criminal adventure, and constant motion. Even the music he carries with him functions as both connection and avoidance. The awesome mix is the last gift from Meredith, but Peter uses it to preserve an emotional world that no longer exists. His relationship with Yondu adds another layer to that trauma. Yondu rescues Peter from Earth but raises him among Ravagers, who are not exactly a healthy substitute for a family. Peter is threatened, mocked, and reminded that he was small enough to be eaten. The humor around those memories is important, because Peter has learned to transform fear into comedy. If he can laugh at the past, perhaps he does not have to feel it. That is why Gamora becomes so important to him. She is not merely a romantic interest. She is another person who has survived a family defined by violence. She understands what it means to be shaped by someone else's cruelty. Her presence forces Peter to imagine a relationship that is not based entirely on escape. The climax completes that psychological movement. When Gamora is floating helplessly in space, Peter chooses to move toward her. The choice is almost the opposite of his behavior in the hospital. As a child, he could not hold his mother's hand because accepting the moment meant accepting the loss. As an adult, he reaches for Gamora knowing that he may die. He is finally willing to stay. The opening of Awesome Mix Volume 2 after the main story carries this transformation forward. Peter discovers the second gift his mother left behind, something she had given him before he was emotionally capable of understanding it. The tape represents a future relationship with Meredith, rather than only a preserved memory of her. He cannot bring her back, but he can accept that her love still exists within him. Peter's arc is therefore not about becoming a better fighter. It is about becoming emotionally present. Star-Lord begins the movie trying to convince the galaxy that he is legendary. Peter ends it understanding that being loved by a few people may matter more than being admired by everyone. Ronan the Accuser is almost deliberately constructed as the opposite of the Guardians. Where they are chaotic, he is rigid. Where they improvise, he follows doctrine. Where they are slowly learning to forgive, he is consumed by grievance. Ronan's hatred of the Nova Empire is rooted in a long history of conflict, and even when political agreements create a path toward peace, he refuses to accept compromise. To him, peace is not healing. It is surrender. That makes him more than a conventional villain. He represents what happens when grief and ideology become inseparable. Ronan has experienced historical violence, but instead of processing that pain, he turns it into a permanent worldview. Everyone outside his belief system becomes an enemy. His seriousness also creates an intentional tonal contrast with the Guardians. He looks like the villain from a traditional space opera. Imposing armor, ritualistic language, enormous weapons, and a worldview based on absolute certainty. The Guardians constantly undermine that certainty simply by refusing to behave according to his expectations. Yet Ronan's relative simplicity as a character is also one of the film's weaknesses. Lee Pace gives him physical authority and theatrical intensity, but the screenplay does not explore him with the same psychological detail given to the heroes. His ideological hatred is clear, but his inner contradictions remain underdeveloped. He ultimately becomes more of a force the Guardians must overcome than a character who changes the meaning of their journey. Behind Ronan, however, stands an even more important threat: Thanos. The brief appearances of Thanos establish the larger architecture of the MCU's cosmic story, while also introducing a disturbing family dynamic. Gamora and Nebula are not simply warriors serving a powerful father figure. They are daughters shaped by his manipulation. Thanos turns competition between them into a weapon, forcing them to measure their worth against each other. Gamora's eventual rejection of that system becomes part of the film's larger argument about chosen identity. She does not have to remain the person Thanos created. Ronan, meanwhile, chooses the opposite path. He allows his ideology to define him completely. That contrast becomes especially meaningful when compared with the Guardians. Ronan seeks power so that he can destroy the people he believes have wronged him. The Guardians eventually seek connection, because they realize that destruction cannot heal them. Ronan is what unresolved grievance looks like when it becomes an entire identity. The Guardians represent the possibility of choosing something else. Their victory, therefore, means more than defeating a villain. It means refusing to become the worst thing that happened to them. Gamora, Drax, Rocket, and Groot each represent a different response to trauma. And the genius of the group is that none of those responses is presented as completely healthy. Gamora has been shaped by abuse and forced loyalty. Thanos took her from her original life and turned her into an assassin, then repeatedly compared her to Nebula as part of a brutal competition. Her strength is real, but it has been built inside a system that taught her survival requires obedience. Her journey is therefore about reclaiming ownership of herself. She does not simply escape Thanos physically. She begins rejecting the identity he gave her. Drax responds to grief differently. He turns his loss into purpose. Every thought points toward Ronan. Every action is measured against revenge. And his inability to understand metaphor becomes more than a comedic trait. It reflects a man who wants language to be concrete, because emotional ambiguity has become unbearable. If words mean exactly what they say, perhaps the world can become understandable again. Rocket's trauma is even more explicitly connected to his body. He has been experimented on, modified, and treated as an object rather than a person. His anger is therefore both defensive and existential. He mocks others before they can mock him. He laughs at emotional vulnerability because vulnerability once made him powerless. His cruelty is a shield built from the expectation that everyone eventually leaves or hurts you. Groot provides the opposite response. He does not hide his emotional nature. He is physically powerful but emotionally gentle. His simplicity becomes a form of wisdom because he does not need to prove that he is intelligent, important, or superior. He simply protects the people he cares about. That makes him the emotional grounding point of the group. Together, these characters create a strange psychological ecosystem. Gamora wants control. Drax wants revenge. Rocket wants distance. Peter wants admiration. Groot wants connection. None of those desires initially align, which is why their chemistry feels so unpredictable. But the film gradually reveals that their apparent differences are actually complementary. Gamora teaches Peter that strength can coexist with vulnerability. Drax learns that revenge is not the same as justice. Rocket discovers that attachment is not automatically weakness. Peter learns that family cannot always be inherited. Groot demonstrates that empathy does not require explanation. The group works because each character possesses something the others lack. Their emotional development is therefore communal rather than individual. They do not heal alone. They become capable of healing because somebody else keeps forcing them to confront what they have avoided. That is the deeper reason the Guardians feel different from many superhero teams. They are not assembling because destiny selected them. They are assembling because life damaged them in compatible ways. At the center of Guardians of the Galaxy is a deceptively simple question. What makes a family? The film begins with biological family and immediately complicates it. Peter loses his mother. Gamora is separated from her original family and raised by Thanos. Drax loses his wife and daughter. Rocket has no meaningful biological family within the story. Groot's relationship with Rocket becomes stronger than any formal definition of friendship. Each character enters the movie carrying some version of familial loss, and that shared absence becomes the foundation for a new kind of family. The Guardians are not bound by blood. They are bound by choice. That distinction is crucial because the film does not pretend that biological families are always safe. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the source of your deepest wounds. Thanos is technically Gamora's father figure, but his relationship with her is abusive. Yondu is Peter's adoptive father figure, but his parenting is shaped by violence and neglect. The movie therefore separates the concept of family from the concept of belonging. A family is not automatically the people who claim you. It can be the people who choose you when they have no obligation to do so. Unresolved grief connects every member of the team. Peter has lost his mother. Gamora has lost her original identity. Drax has lost his family. Rocket carries the psychological scars of having been treated as something less than human. Groot's own history is barely explained, but his loyalty demonstrates an acceptance of loss that the others have not yet achieved. They all begin the film defined by what has been taken from them. By the end, they begin to be defined by what they are willing to protect. That movement creates the film's redemption theme. Can a thief become a hero? Can an assassin choose mercy? Can a murderer redirect his strength toward protection? Can someone who expects betrayal learn trust? The movie does not require its characters to become morally pure. It simply asks whether they can choose differently from the identities imposed on them. This also connects to the theme of destiny and authority. Ronan believes his identity is inseparable from historical grievance. Thanos treats people as instruments. The Nova Corps defines law through institutional power. The Guardians, meanwhile, create their own purpose. They do not begin as heroes because nobody has designated them heroes. They become heroes through action. That distinction gives the movie its emotional freedom. Heroism is not a birthright. It is a choice. And for damaged people, choosing to care can be one of the most radical forms of rebellion available. The visual language of Guardians of the Galaxy immediately separates it from the darker science fiction aesthetic that had become common in blockbuster cinema. Instead of burying the universe in gray metal and muted tones, the film embraces saturated color, strange costumes, glowing technology, alien skin tones, and environments that feel almost theatrical. The colors are not simply decorative. They reinforce the film's emotional openness. Danger can be bright. Comedy can exist inside violence. Beauty can emerge from places that should feel grotesque. Nowhere, for example, is literally a mining operation inside the severed head of an ancient celestial. Yet the location becomes a vibrant social environment, rather than a purely horrifying image. The film repeatedly refuses the assumption that darkness must look dark. That philosophy also applies to Peter's most important object, the Walkman and its cassette tapes. In a universe filled with advanced technology, Peter chooses to preserve an obsolete human object. The Walkman cannot connect to the internet. It cannot communicate across galaxies. It cannot provide navigation or tactical data. Its value is entirely emotional. It is important because Meredith gave it to him. The tape is therefore a physical anchor to Earth and to maternal love. Whenever Peter listens, he is carrying a piece of humanity into a universe that otherwise seems impossibly distant from his childhood. The recurring imagery of hands strengthens this idea. Meredith asks Peter to hold her hand, and he refuses. Later, Peter reaches for Gamora in space. At the climax, the Guardians physically hold on to one another, while sharing the Power Stone's energy. The film begins with Peter unable to accept a hand and ends with him relying on several hands to survive. That is not accidental visual repetition. It is the emotional structure of the movie expressed through physical action. Light also becomes symbolic. Groot's glowing spores and the luminous environments throughout the film create moments where beauty appears inside darkness. Groot's final sacrifice aboard the Dark Aster is especially powerful, because his powers turn him into a protective light within a terrifying environment. The visual message is simple without being simplistic. Darkness does not disappear because someone is strong enough to destroy it. Sometimes darkness becomes survivable, because someone chooses to create a small space of safety inside it. The movie's color palette therefore reflects its larger philosophy. It is not afraid of darkness, but it refuses to believe darkness is the only honest way to portray serious emotion. The awesome mix can be understood as the film's most unusual storytelling device because it turns music into communication. Peter does not explain his relationship with Meredith through long flashbacks. He carries her voice through songs. The cassette becomes almost like a secular form of communion. Instead of receiving a sacred object from a religious institution, Peter receives a collection of music that contains pieces of another person's emotional identity. Sharing those songs becomes a form of sharing the self. When Peter introduces someone else to the music, he is allowing them into the private world his mother created for him. That makes the soundtrack dramatically different from a conventional compilation. The songs are not simply accompanying the action. They are telling us what Peter cannot say. The choice of older pop music also subverts the traditional space opera model. Star Wars and similar films often establish their worlds through orchestral grandeur, invented musical languages, and heroic themes. Guardians does use orchestral scoring, but it repeatedly interrupts that grandeur with songs that existed before the story. The effect is almost disruptive. The cosmic universe is forced to coexist with earthly memory. A massive spaceship battle can be accompanied by a song about love. A dangerous criminal can dance to something his mother listened to decades earlier. The result is a universe where the ordinary and the extraordinary occupy the same emotional space. That approach also becomes a subtle critique of corporate science fiction homogenization. The movie has all the ingredients of an enormous franchise product, yet it constantly insists on personal specificity. Characters are weird. Its humor is strange. Its music is unexpected. Its colors are excessive. Its emotional logic is built around damaged people rather than destiny. That specificity is what prevents the film from feeling completely manufactured. Rocket provides perhaps the clearest philosophical example. He begins from a position close to nihilism. He assumes life is cruel, people are unreliable, and attachment is dangerous. His anger protects him from disappointment, because expecting the worst makes every betrayal feel inevitable. But the Guardians gradually convert that nihilistic energy into collective purpose. Rocket does not suddenly become optimistic. He simply discovers that caring about someone can be worth the risk. That is the film's larger philosophical movement. Meaning does not have to be discovered in some cosmic destiny. It can be created through relationships. The universe may be indifferent, history may be violent, and life may be unfair. But people can still choose to protect one another. In that sense, the Guardians do not defeat nihilism by proving that the universe is benevolent. They defeat it by deciding that their lives can matter to each other, even if the universe offers no guarantees. Making Rocket and Groot believable was one of the production's most difficult technical challenges, because the audience had to accept two impossible creatures as emotionally equal to the human actors around them. Rocket could not simply look impressive. He needed to feel like a character occupying the same physical world as Peter, Gamora, and Drax. Bradley Cooper provided the voice, giving Rocket an aggressive, sarcastic, emotionally volatile personality, but the performance could not exist only in a recording booth. Gunn served as Rocket's on-set physical reference, often crouching and moving through scenes so the human performers had something tangible to react to. That mattered because acting is relational. If Peter looks down at an empty patch of floor and talks to a microphone, the scene can become emotionally abstract. If Chris Pratt has a moving physical presence in front of him, the performance becomes more specific. Rocket's animation then had to preserve that specificity. The visual effects artists had to balance realism with expression. For needed to react naturally to movement and light, but Rocket's face also needed enough expressive range to communicate sarcasm, fear, anger, and vulnerability. The challenge was especially important because a photorealistic animal, with a completely artificial personality, can easily fall into the uncanny valley. The audience needed to forget the technology and simply believe that Rocket was there. Groot created a different problem. His body was enormous and visually complex, yet his emotional communication depended on extremely limited dialogue. Every movement had to carry meaning. A tilt of the head could be curiosity. A slow gesture could suggest affection. The rhythm of his movement could transform a simple "I am Groot" into something joyful, threatening, apologetic, or heartbreaking. The effects work therefore became part animation, part acting. The environments presented another enormous challenge. Nowhere had to feel like a functioning location rather than a digital concept. Building a city inside a severed celestial head required a combination of practical sets, digital extensions, textures, lighting, and production design. Longcross Studios provided physical spaces that gave actors something tangible to inhabit, while visual effects expanded those spaces into enormous alien environments. The film repeatedly uses this combination of practical and digital techniques to make its impossible world feel tactile. Creatures have physical textures. Costumes interact with real light. Weapons have weight. Sets provide surfaces that actors can touch. That tactile quality is one reason the movie continues to feel more grounded than its premise suggests. The technology is often spectacular, but the filmmakers understood that spectacle works best when it has physical reference points. The audience does not consciously analyze the rendering of fur or the construction of a digital city while watching. Instead, they simply accept that these things exist. That acceptance is the real achievement. Rocket and Groot are not impressive because viewers can identify how much visual effects work went into them. They are impressive because viewers stop thinking about visual effects altogether. James Gunn's strongest contribution to the film was not any individual visual trick. It was his refusal to separate tone from character. Gunn understood that the movie could move from absurd comedy to genuine grief only if the emotional stakes remained consistent underneath both. He therefore built the screenplay around songs, jokes, violence, and sadness as parts of the same personality, rather than competing genres. Music was often incorporated directly into the writing process, allowing the filmmakers to design sequences around the rhythm and emotional identity of specific songs. This gave the movie a distinctive editorial pulse. A scene could begin like a traditional action sequence and suddenly become a dance routine without feeling like the film had changed personalities. Gunn also resisted the increasingly common desaturated blockbuster aesthetic. The world of Guardians is allowed to be colorful. Alien skin is vibrant. Costumes have bold identities. Spaceships glow against dark backgrounds. Even the villains exist within an environment that feels visually varied. The result is a movie that communicates emotional energy through color, rather than relying entirely on darkness to signal seriousness. Tone management became especially important because the film's premise could easily have collapsed under its own contradictions. How do you place a joke immediately before a scene of death without making the death meaningless? How do you make a character like Drax funny while respecting the grief that motivates him? How do you let Peter behave like an immature fool while still asking audiences to care about him? Gunn's answer was to avoid treating comedy and emotion as opposites. The jokes reveal character. The sadness reveals character. Both are expressions of the same psychological reality. His collaborative relationship with the cast also contributed to that feeling. Pratt's improvisational energy became part of Peter's identity. Bautista discovered that Drax's seriousness could itself be funny, especially when contrasted with everyone else's sarcasm. Gunn allowed performers to explore timing and physical behavior, which helped the dialogue feel less mechanically delivered. The camera work supports that philosophy. Action sequences are kinetic, but the movie is rarely interested in making movement impressive for its own sake. Camera motion often follows character energy. Peter dances. Rocket calculates. Drax charges. Gamora moves with precision. Groot creates large physical shapes within the frame. The visual style therefore emerges from personality. That is one reason the movie feels more authored than many franchise installments. Gunn did not merely direct a Marvel story. He imposed a specific emotional grammar on it. He understood that if the audience believed in the characters, they would follow them anywhere. Even into a universe where a talking raccoon might be the person who breaks your heart. Tyler Bates' original score performs an important balancing act because Guardians of the Galaxy needs to sound both like a traditional superhero epic and like something completely outside the normal Marvel formula. The score provides the heroic architecture that the licensed songs alone cannot supply. Brass, percussion, orchestral textures, and large thematic statements give the Guardians moments of genuine grandeur. When the characters move toward battle, the music can make them feel like an established heroic team, even though they spent most of the movie fighting among themselves. That transformation is musically significant. The audience hears the Guardians become larger than their individual personalities. The score also provides darker material for Ronan and the Kree, creating a sense of threat that the comedy cannot provide by itself. The villains need to feel dangerous even when Peter is making jokes, and orchestral weight establishes that danger. One particularly interesting aspect of the production was the use of music during filming. Gunn's close relationship with the soundtrack meant that musical ideas could influence the rhythm of scenes before the final edit existed. When filmmakers allow music to become part of the physical production process, rather than adding it at the end, performances can develop around rhythm and timing. This is especially important for a film where songs are not merely background decoration. The score and the licensed tracks also have to coexist without competing. A pop song may define a scene's personality, while the orchestral score takes over when the emotional or dramatic register changes. That transition can happen almost invisibly. The audience may not consciously notice the moment when the soundtrack shifts from a recognizable song to original orchestration, but the emotional effect is still felt. The score therefore acts as connective tissue. The songs keep the movie rooted in Peter's human past, while Bates' music gives the Guardians a future as cosmic heroes. One belongs to memory, the other belongs to myth. The movie needs both because Peter's transformation is about bringing those two identities together. He does not become Star-Lord by abandoning Earth. He becomes Star-Lord by carrying the emotional inheritance of Earth into the galaxy. The music makes that contradiction audible. The Awesome Mix Volume 1 is arguably the most famous playlist in superhero cinema, but its popularity can obscure how carefully it functions as narrative dialogue. Hooked on a Feeling tells the audience immediately that this movie is comfortable being playful. Come and Get Your Love turns Peter's introduction into a character statement. He is not simply entering an alien environment. He is bringing a piece of Earth with him. Ain't No Mountain High Enough carries an almost ironic emotional weight, because the lyrics can be heard as a promise of connection, even while Peter remains emotionally separated from his mother. Fooled Around and Fell in Love adds another layer of romantic and comedic identity. Oh Child eventually becomes part of the film's emotional atmosphere around survival and hope. These songs are doing the work of dialogue because Peter cannot articulate his history directly. The music speaks where he cannot. Sound design extends the same philosophy into the action. Yondu's Yaka arrow needs a signature that audiences can recognize instantly, because the weapon's movement is part of his character. Rocket's blasters have their own aggressive sonic identity. The spaceships, explosions, alien weapons, and environments all require distinct sounds, so the cosmic world does not become an undifferentiated wall of noise. Good sound design creates spatial information. You understand where danger is coming from, how powerful a weapon is, and how large an environment feels without consciously analyzing any of it. The film's soundscape also benefits from the contrast between familiar music and unfamiliar technology. A recognizable 70s song can suddenly play over an alien battlefield, creating a strange bridge between Earth culture and cosmic spectacle. That contrast became one of the film's defining aesthetic signatures. It also had a remarkable cultural afterlife. The soundtrack became a Billboard #1 album, a major achievement for a collection built around previously released songs, rather than a conventional album of newly commissioned pop material. The commercial success confirmed something the studio could not have known in advance. Audiences were not merely tolerating the old songs. They were actively embracing them as part of the movie's identity. The awesome mix became merchandise, conversation, playlists, and nostalgia. It turned the soundtrack into something viewers could carry outside the theater. That is the ultimate proof that the music worked. A successful film song enhances a scene. A great film soundtrack changes the way people remember the entire movie. When Guardians of the Galaxy opened in August 2014, the result immediately challenged the assumptions that had surrounded the project. The film opened to roughly $94 million domestically, and eventually earned more than $773 million worldwide, transforming what had looked like a risky experiment into a major commercial success. Critics responded enthusiastically as well, with the film earning a 92% critics score on Rotten Tomatoes and developing powerful word of mouth. The important point was not simply that people liked the movie. They talked about it. They repeated the jokes. They quoted Groot. They discussed the soundtrack. They argued about which character was funniest. The phrase "I am Groot" became instantly recognizable far beyond the audience that had ever read a Guardians comic. That cultural penetration demonstrated the film's ability to create characters that could survive outside the narrative itself. Groot was especially important because his simplicity made him easy to understand across languages and age groups. His limited vocabulary became a feature rather than a limitation. The character's emotional appeal also translated into merchandise, most famously through the dancing baby Groot phenomenon that followed in the broader Guardians franchise. The film's musical impact was equally striking. Songs from previous decades received renewed attention as audiences searched for the tracks they had heard in theaters. Older pop music gained another life through digital platforms, downloads, and streaming. The soundtrack became a gateway through which younger listeners discovered music that existed decades before they were born. That is one of the most unusual forms of cultural influence a blockbuster can achieve. It did not simply sell a fictional universe. It redirected attention toward real cultural artifacts. Social media amplified the process. Memes, quotes, character images, and soundtrack references spread rapidly, helping the film become part of online conversation. Yet beneath the commercial phenomenon was something more difficult to manufacture: emotional sincerity. Audiences laughed at Rocket and Groot, but they also cried when Groot sacrificed himself. They laughed at Drax's literal interpretations, and then understood the pain beneath his obsession with Ronan. They enjoyed Peter's swagger while gradually recognizing that his entire personality was built around grief. The film therefore became popular without requiring audiences to choose between fun and emotion. It offered both. In an era when blockbuster success was increasingly associated with franchise familiarity, Guardians demonstrated that a movie could create a new cultural vocabulary almost from scratch. The influence of Guardians of the Galaxy became more visible as Hollywood tried to reproduce the ingredients that appeared to make it successful. Retro licensed soundtracks suddenly became a common feature of trailers, action movies, superhero films, and television series. Studios discovered the marketing power of pairing old songs with modern spectacle. The technique was not invented by Guardians, but the film demonstrated how deeply music could become part of a blockbuster's identity, rather than merely an accessory. Its influence can also be seen in the changing tone of superhero cinema. Films such as Thor: Ragnarok embraced louder color, stranger comedy, and more openly eccentric character interactions. Outside Marvel, Suicide Squad and other studio projects attempted to capture the same combination of comic book spectacle and pop music identity. Some succeeded more effectively than others, but the trend itself demonstrated how strongly Guardians had altered the expectations of the genre. Perhaps the most important influence was conceptual. The movie proved that audiences did not necessarily need recognizable intellectual property if the characters were compelling. Before Guardians, there was a widespread assumption that obscurity was a commercial weakness. After it, studios became more willing to consider strange comic book properties if they believed a distinctive filmmaker could make the characters emotionally accessible. Marvel also gained confidence in the cosmic side of its universe. The success of the Guardians opened more space for stories involving characters and settings that would have seemed commercially dangerous before. The MCU could move away from Earth, introduce increasingly bizarre concepts, and trust audiences to follow. That expansion eventually contributed to the larger cosmic architecture involving Thanos, the Infinity Stones, and the later Avengers films. But the most lasting lesson was not put old songs in your movie. That was merely the most visible trick. The deeper lesson was that audiences respond to specificity. They can accept a talking tree if the tree feels real. They can accept a raccoon if the raccoon has emotional contradictions. They can accept a bizarre universe if the people inside it behave as though their feelings matter. The film did not make strange ideas popular by making them less strange. It made them popular by giving the strangeness a human center. That is much harder to imitate. The unusual achievement of Guardians of the Galaxy is that critics and general audiences largely responded to the same qualities. Critics appreciated the film's personality and its refusal to feel like another anonymous franchise installment. The movie arrived during a period when blockbuster filmmaking was increasingly criticized for becoming assembly line entertainment, yet Guardians felt unusually authored. James Gunn's humor, visual preferences, music choices, and character rhythms gave the film a distinct voice. Critics could recognize the craftsmanship beneath the spectacle, while casual audiences could simply enjoy the adventure. That combination is difficult to achieve because sophisticated analysis and immediate entertainment often pull in different directions. Here they reinforced each other. The emotional sincerity helped critics take the comedy seriously, while the comedy prevented the emotional material from becoming heavy-handed. The audience response reflected the same balance. People could leave the theater remembering a joke and a heartbreaking moment with equal clarity. The film received an A Cinema score, indicating strong audience satisfaction, while its Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic reception confirmed that professional reviewers were broadly positive as well. That alignment matters because it suggests the movie did not need to compromise one audience to satisfy another. Its accessible surface contained enough depth for viewers who wanted more. The film could be experienced as a colorful space adventure, a character comedy, a family story, a grief narrative, or a commentary on superhero formulas. None of those interpretations cancels the others. In fact, they become stronger when combined. The critics saw the craftsmanship. The audience felt the emotional connection. Both reactions ultimately pointed toward the same conclusion. Marvel had created something unusually confident. For all its strengths, Guardians of the Galaxy is not immune to criticism. The most obvious weakness is Ronan. Lee Pace brings impressive physical intensity and theatrical menace to the role, but the character is written more as a functional antagonist than as a fully developed psychological opponent. His hatred of Xander and refusal to accept peace provide context, yet the film spends far more time exploring the wounds of the Guardians than the ideology of the man opposing them. As a result, Ronan can feel like a disposable Marvel villain whose primary purpose is to create an external threat. The film also has to carry a considerable amount of franchise setup. The Infinity Stone, the Collector, Thanos, the Kree, and the broader cosmic mythology all need to be introduced while the main story is moving forward. Some exposition is handled naturally, but other moments can feel like the movie is quietly preparing the audience for stories that have not happened yet. This is one of the unavoidable burdens of the MCU structure. The film wants to function as a complete adventure while simultaneously existing as one piece of a much larger machine. The pacing can also become uneven. The movie is energetic for long stretches,